It started with a letter. I remember that day clearly, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted from another mind-numbing day at the office. The letter was sitting on the kitchen counter where my wife, Clara, had left it. It was from a lawyer's office, and I had no idea what it could be about. Curiosity piqued. I tore it open, not expecting much. The letter informed me that I had inherited a cabin from a distant relative, an uncle I barely remembered. Uncle David was a recluse, someone who had cut ties with most of the family long before I was born. I had vague memories of my father mentioning him in passing, usually with a dismissive tone, but I had never met him. Apparently, Uncle David had passed away a few weeks earlier, and as his only living relative, I had inherited his cabin deep in the woods. The idea of owning a cabin intrigued me. Clara and I had always talked about getting away from the city, about finding a place where we could escape the noise and stress of our daily lives. I pictured a quaint, cozy retreat surrounded by trees, with a lake nearby where we could fish or just sit and relax. It sounded perfect. Clara was hesitant when I told her about it, but she agreed that it might be nice to check it out. We decided to spend a weekend there to see if it could be the escape we were looking for. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. As we left the highway and took a winding dirt road deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches casting long shadows that danced across the road. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle began to fall, adding to the sense of isolation. When we finally arrived, I was taken aback. The cabin was nothing like the idyllic retreat I had imagined. It was old, much older than I had anticipated, and in a state of disrepair. The wooden siding was weathered and cracked, and the windows were grimy with dust and cobwebs. The roof sagged in places, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly to one side, as if it were trying to escape into the forest. Despite its appearance, there was something compelling about the cabin. It had a certain charm, a sense of history that intrigued me. Clara, however, was less impressed. She looked around with a frown, clearly regretting the decision to come. We unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was musty, and the interior was dark, with only a few rays of light filtering through the dirty windows. The furniture was old and covered in dust, and the floors creaked with every step. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. As we explored the cabin, I found an old journal tucked away in a drawer in the bedroom. It was Uncle David's journal, filled with entries that detailed his life in the cabin. As I skimmed through the pages, I noticed that the tone of the entries changed over time. The early entries were filled with descriptions of the beauty and solitude of the forest. But as the years went on, the entries became darker, more paranoid. He wrote about strange noises in the night, about feeling watched, and about something lurking in the woods. Clara was uneasy, and I couldn't blame her. There was something about the cabin that felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Still, I was determined to make the most of our weekend. We spent the day cleaning up, trying to make the place feel a little more livable. By evening, we had a fire going in the old stone fireplace, and the cabin was starting to feel a little more cozy. That night, as we settled into the old bed, the wind picked up outside, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. The sound was eerie, but I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the place. Clara was already asleep, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from outside the cabin. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the wall. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too precise. It moved around the cabin, from one wall to the next, as if someone, or something, was circling the cabin, tapping as it went. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, now coming from the window next to the bed. I reached out to wake Clara, but before I could, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, straining to hear any other sounds, but there was nothing. Slowly, I lay back down, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I mentioned the tapping to Clara, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just a branch hitting the cabin. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. As the weekend went on, the sense of unease grew. During the day, the cabin felt almost normal, but as soon as the sun began to set, the atmosphere changed. The shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The noises in the night continued. Sometimes it was the tapping, other times it was a distant whispering that seemed to come from just outside the cabin walls. I found myself drawn to Uncle David's journal, reading and rereading the entries. He had experienced the same things: the noises, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was out there in the woods, waiting. He wrote about how he had tried to leave the cabin, but something always pulled him back, as if the cabin itself had a hold on him. One night, as I sat by the fireplace reading the journal, I came across an entry that sent a chill down my spine. Uncle David had written about seeing something in the woods, a figure, tall and thin, with glowing eyes that watched him from the darkness. He described how it would appear at the edge of the trees, just out of reach, and how it seemed to beckon him into the forest. I looked up from the journal and glanced out the window. The trees were shrouded in darkness, their branches swaying in the wind. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, but when I looked again, it was gone. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it lingered. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind and the creaking of the cabin. I thought about Uncle David, about the figure he had seen in the woods. What if it was still out there, watching, waiting? On our last night at the cabin, I couldn't sleep. The sense of foreboding had grown too strong, and I felt as if something terrible was about to happen. Clara was sound asleep beside me, but I was on edge, my heart racing. Around midnight, I heard it again, the tapping, soft and rhythmic, moving around the cabin. This time, I didn't wait. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and headed for the door. I had to know what was out there. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The wind howled through the trees, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the clearing. I stood there, listening, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The tapping had stopped, but I felt it, a presence, just beyond the edge of the trees. I turned the flashlight toward the woods, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It stood perfectly still, watching me. For a moment, I was frozen with fear. Then slowly, the figure began to move. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it were testing me, seeing how I would react. I wanted to run, to get back inside the cabin and lock the door, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, and my heart pounded in my chest. The figure came closer, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. Finally, something snapped inside me, and I turned and ran back into the cabin. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. Clara woke up, startled by the noise, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, staring at the door, waiting for the figure to come after me. But it didn't. The rest of the night passed in a tense, uneasy silence, and when morning came, I was still awake. sitting by the door with the flashlight in my hand. As soon as the sun rose, Clara and I packed our things and left the cabin. I didn't tell her what I had seen. I didn't need to. She could see the fear in my eyes, and she didn't ask any questions. We drove away from the cabin, the dirt road winding through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Even as we left the forest behind and returned to the safety of the city, the sense of dread lingered. I never went back to the cabin. I tried to forget about it, to push the memories out of my mind, but they haunted me. I would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the tapping, seeing the glowing eyes in the darkness. Uncle David's journal sits on a shelf in my office, untouched. I can't bring myself to read it again, but I can't throw it away either. It's a reminder of what happened, of the dark presence that still lurks in the woods, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside and the shadows grow long, I think I hear it. The tapping, faint and rhythmic, coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of the light.